Good morning from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. A draft of Egypt's new constitution will be delivered to President Mohamed Morsi today, setting the stage for a national referendum sometime this month. And Private First Class Bradley Manning, accused of leaking classified documents to WikiLeaks, will return to court in Fort Meade, Maryland today. We'll be talking about the Manning case in just a bit. But right now, I'm joined by Richard Ehrenberg, co-author of Defending the Filibuster, the Soul of the Senate, and a former chief of staff and legislative director to several senators. Alan Fruman, who retired as parliamentarian of the U.S. Senate last year, and whose appearance here is his first television interview since then. Akil Amar, author of America's Unwritten Constitution, The Precedents and Principles We Live By, and Sterling Professor of Law at Yale Law School. And MSNBC contributor Victoria De Francesco Soto, fellow at the Center for Politics and Governance at LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas. Great to have you all here. All right. If President Obama wants to get anything done in his second term, Democrats in the Senate will have to overcome one major obstacle, the filibuster. Since Democrats took control of both chambers of Congress in 2007, Republicans have used the filibuster as a bludgeon against Democratic attempts to pass even basic legislation. The percentage of bills introduced in the Senate that actually pass has dropped from just over 25% in 1955 to a record low of just 2.8% this year, according to the Brennan Center for Justice. The rate held steady at about 10% through the Clinton and Bush years and then plummeted when Democrats took control of Congress in 2007. That is due in no small part to the filibuster. The filibuster has mutated in the last century from a quirk of the Senate rules to a routine impediment to legislative progress. It has turned Congress into a body incapable of acting except in times of crisis. The dysfunction has gotten so bad that Congress must now create crises for itself just to get anything done, like the current standoff over what I call the fiscal curb, a series of automatic tax increases and spending cuts that were designed to force Congress to deal with the deficit. Now, Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid is proposing changes to the filibuster that might make the Senate less dysfunctional. Reid's proposal would tweak the rules so that bills can at least reach the floor of the Senate before being filibustered, among other changes. Right now, senators can simply block motions to proceed, which means the Senate can't even debate the legislation in question. President Obama, realizing the stakes for his second-term agenda, endorsed those changes on Tuesday. White House Communications Director Dan Pfeiffer said in a statement, quote, "The president supports Senator Reid's efforts to reform the filibuster process. The American people deserve a United States Senate that puts them first instead of partisan delay." Reid has a brief window when the next Congress sits in January to change the filibuster with just a 51-vote majority. And he is getting very close to getting that majority, with just a few remaining Democrats undecided on the issue. Republicans, meanwhile, are apoplectic. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell has accused Reid of throwing a bomb into the Senate, and House Speaker John Boehner said Thursday he will block any and all legislation that is passed in the Senate if the filibuster is curtailed. All right. Let's start at the most basic principle level, before we get into the weeds of Senate procedure and the current reform proposals on the table. I would just like to put forth the proposition that the filibuster itself is a ridiculous thing that we shouldn't have. And that if we have come to see it as normal, and it has been normalized because it's existed for a while, and there's something to say about tradition. But if we had this stipulation in any other area of democratic governance, we would absolutely blanch. For instance, if Egypt right now, which is making their new constitution, says you can only be elected president of Egypt with 60% of the vote. Or if we said here in the United States, you can only be elected president with 60% of the vote. Imagine the absolute chaos that would throw American democratic processes into. As the man who wrote the book, literally, Defending the Filibuster, make the case for me why we should have this institution at all.
Well, first off, let me observe that we do elect presidents sometimes with less than 50%
yes,
of the vote. Sure. Even presidents who didn't get the most votes. Yeah. So it's the filibuster isn't the only odd rule we have.
I agree. I'm going after them one by
yes.
one. But yeah.
The long history of the Senate, more than 200 years. Filibuster has been around for a good deal of that. The role that the Senate has played historically in our system is it's the last place where minority rights are protected. And the twin pillars, the foundation of what makes the Senate a unique body is unlimited debate and unfettered amendment. Whereas in the House of Representatives, debate is limited, often amendments are not permitted at all. In the Senate, the minority gets to speak, the minority gets to offer its amendments. And these
And the filibuster, you're saying, is the guarantor of that?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's that supermajority requirement that, to overcome a filibuster that requires the majority in the Senate to deal with the minority each and every day.
It's a question of debate. What the filibuster means is that in the Senate there's no general limitation of debate. It's that one thing, that one aspect of Senate procedure, which is deep in the DNA of Senate procedure. Questions are debatable. If questions are debatable, there is no general majority compulsion. And the minority has, if not rights, certainly privileges. And historically, for more than 200 years, the minority has utilized those privileges in something of an inherent implicit contract with the majority. The majority says you may do this, and the minority has gone about doing this over the years, whether it's a Democratic or a Republican minority, with some sense of restraint and some sense of comedy.
Right.
So the majority says you may prevent anything from occurring in the minority.
But you're not going to do that because we all have to go show up here to work the next day.
Generally speaking, historically, minorities have exercised that with some restraint.
So as a Texan, as a Democratic Texan, I'm hypersensitive to the protection of minority rights. We haven't elected a Democrat to statewide office in 20 years. In the House, there was a supermajority of Republicans. In the Senate, the Republicans were 2 votes shy of a 2/3 majority. And in the Texas Senate, you have to have a 2/3 majority in order to bring legislation to the floor. And that's something we just cling on to. And I know it's different than talking about the filibuster at the national level, but it's that lifeline. So, you know, the extreme, and Chris, I know you want to get rid of the filibuster.
Yes.
You're done with the filibuster.
Yeah.
I think there's moderation. I think in changing the rules that you have to be present to filibuster, but we need that lifeline.
Okay, we're going to talk about what the actual reform proposal, because actually no one, aside from, your humble TV host, is proposing scrapping the filibuster. Maybe some other people are. But Akil, but let me push back on one point. I want to push back on one point, and then Akil, get your thoughts. I think it's very important when we talk about the rights of the minority, that has a certain sort of power and force in American life, particularly given what American history has been, right? But I think it's important to distinguish between, we're talking about the minority rights in the context of, say, due process and civil rights, etc. There are rights that protect individual human beings who are maybe on the wrong side of a majoritarian democracy, right. But that's very different than the minority party in a legislative body. I don't think they have to get some sort of special protections.
But they're our voice. They are the voice of the individual.
But that's what elections are for. That's what elections are for.
And likewise, when we talk about majority rule, we're not necessarily talking about the control by the majority party.
Right.
It's the same principle on the other side.
Explain that. What do you mean?
Well, when we talk about the majority, for example, controlling the House of Representatives, what we're talking about is the majority party. We're talking about the Republican Party that controls the House, and they control it quite thoroughly.
Right. Yes.
Through the Rules Committee, the Speaker, as long as he can keep his caucus lined up behind him, he can do essentially what he wants. And we see, by the way, what happens. You mentioned the Texas legislature. We see this in state legislatures in a lot of states across the country where both houses and the governor belong to the same party. What did the senators, when Republicans went after collective bargaining in Wisconsin, what did the state senators do?
They went out to
they left the state.
Right.
What would U.S. senators do? Get on a barge outside the territorial waters?
But the other thing is that Scott Walker won that election. And, yes, you should use every procedural mechanism to fight policies you think are bad, and I support that. If it's in the rules, then use it, fine. But Scott Walker won that election, then he won recall. You get to govern if you're elected. Akil, where's the Constitution on this?
The Constitution is in favor of majority rule. The filibuster, with due respect, is not deep in the DNA of the Senate. In the entire period before the Civil War, name me one time when any major bill was prevented from being voted upon at the end of the day by the minority. There is not one. Thomas Jefferson actually said majority rule is the basic principle. Everyone knows American history, Compromise of 1850, when the Senate got a bare majority of free states, when California came in without an offsetting slave state. That made all the difference, because here's the balance between majority rule and minority right. Minorities should be able to speak. They should be able to make amendments. They should be heard courteously. And then We should take a vote.
To James Madison, very quickly, and this is Federalist 58. The fundamental principle of free government would be reversed, he said, if you had a sort of supermajority threshold. It would no longer the majority that would rule. The power would be transferred to the minority. An interested minority might take advantage of it to screen themselves from equitable sacrifices, well said, or in particular emergencies to extort unreasonable indulgences. Who could ever have foreseen such a thing?
If you look at the Federalist 63 and the Federalist 65, you get the exact opposite sentiment.
But I like this one.
Yeah.
I want to talk to
And with due respect, you do not, okay? Because none of the Federalist Papers champion a supermajority rule for the Senate, and the Senate does not have a supermajority rule for most of its history.
We should also say the Constitution did contemplate places where there should be supermajorities. There are explicit
Absolutely.
requirements.
5 of them.
There are 5 supermajority
Because
requirements.
the default rule elsewhere is simple majority rule. That's how the Supreme Court operates. That's how the House operates. That's how the Senate, in fact, operated.
Hold your thought on responding, and we're also going to bring in the senator, one of the senators who is pioneering and has been one of the most vocal advocates of reforming the filibuster, not scrapping it. We're going to talk about how the filibuster has developed, why it needs reform, and what the best way to reform it is. Right after this break.